Welcome to this week's Haftorah class. This week's Parsha is Matot Masei, but this is one of the three Haftorot of destruction, the Talat de Puranuta, which is Aramaic. So this is a very ancient tradition to read these three. And I was just talking with Sherry about how I find it really interesting that there's no real intended connection to the Parsha for the next 8 weeks. So it's 10 weeks in total, the 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av, the ones that we're in now, that's Tlat de Puranuta. And then there are the 7 weeks of consolation, which takes us from now until Rosh Hashanah time, the Shiva de Nechemta, like Nechama. And so for project, right? The Haftorah project, sort of at large, which was meant to take the place possibly of Torah reading, right? When we couldn't read from the Torah, which is why there's this connection to the Parshat, take such a long break to do something that's a calendar-based experience as opposed to a Parsha-based experience. I don't have any answers, but I think it's an interesting thing. And I did want to correct that I had said, right, I think I had said to Diana and Judith 2 weeks ago that it was like an interesting switch of Haftorot, but I was wrong. It was about Pinchas, which was last week's. So last week was Parshat Pinchas. And there is a Haftorah that is associated with Pinchas. It's a story about Eliyahu because there are a lot of ideas out there that Pinchas and Eliyahu are sort of one and the same. When God gives Pinchas a Brit Shalom in last week's Parsha, it's sort of unclear what that is. And some people think that it means that he will live forever. And Eliyahu is sort of commonly known to have been taken up to the sky in a chariot of fire, but nowhere does it say he actually died. And so that's like one of many links that links Pinchas and Eliyahu together. So it's not surprising that there will be an Eliyahu story as the Haftorah. However, what it said is that in a year, the way that the Stone Chumash frames it, and I think Judith has that book if she's here, is that Pinchas, in years when Matot and Masei are read together, like this year, you read Matot's Haftorah for Pinchas. I don't know if you see that, Judith, right? But we were looking in the wrong place last time. It's for Pinchas. So it says, if Matot and Masei are split apart, you read Matot for Pinchas and Masei's Haftorah for Matot Masei, which I thought was one of those like weird switches like we'd seen before where like we really didn't want to read one Haftorah, but it's not that. It's just a fancy way of saying in the 3 weeks, you read the 3 weeks Haftorahs. And so even if Pinchas is the first of the 3 weeks, you read the first of the 3 weeks Haftorahs on that day, which is in fact what we did. So we missed the Malachim Haftorah of Eliyahu, and we read the first of the weeks of Puranuta, of punishment or destruction, which is the very beginning of Sefer Yirmiyahu. Even in these hard weeks of Puranuta, we have a custom to end the Haftarah on a high note, or at least a note of like an upswing. And so we read into the beginning of the second prophecy because we want to hit a nice note. And then we pick up in Yirmiyahu this week. And next week, we will read from Yeshayahu. The Chazon Yeshayahu, the vision of Yeshayahu, is similar but different, and maybe we'll look a little bit more about that next week. But this week we'll focus mostly on Yirmiyahu.
Are we starting a new book next week? I'm a little confused. Devarim?
Yes, great point. We are starting a new book, but interestingly, for much of Devarim, we don't read a Haftarah connected to the content because we're reading these 7 weeks of Nechemta, right? The consolation after Tisha B'Av. So it happens. And again, I'm not a master of the calendar. I was surprised that Matot Masei were together this year because it's a leap year, and I thought all the coupled parshiot split apart, but this one does not, because the goal is to get it in during the 3 weeks, I guess. I always read Devarim on Shabbat Chazon, which is the week before Tisha B'Av. So this week is Matot Masei, which finishes Bamidbar, and next week starts Devarim. But we are reading these unrelated Haftorot about the like warnings for Bnei Israel to repent before bad things happen. As we lead up, I think that the way the calendar is designed gives us like what I would call a long runway to Tisha B'Av, right? You can't just sort of walk into Tisha B'Av and feel sad automatically. And so some of the things we do in the 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av are meant to enhance our awareness of destruction, I think is how I would put it. So one of those things is not listening to live music, not getting your hair cut, not having weddings or simchas. And then once Rosh Chodesh Av on Sunday night, Monday happens, we kick up that sort of awareness to the next level of not eating meat and not swimming for pleasure. And, there's a whole beautiful, well-compiled list by Rav Ari on the shul website for like all the details, but they're meant to sort of ease us into mourning. And then on Tisha B'Av itself, that's sort of the ultimate morning experience. And so the Haftorah are another tool in that toolbox of like letting us know that this really sad, terrible thing is coming. And so we should be prepared or preparing for that on some level. So the first two prophecies of Yeshayahu and the first, of Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, which is what we're looking at today, and the first prophecy of Yeshayahu next week, are the three selections that we read that are about reproach of the people for doing the wrong thing, right? We typically say that the first temple was destroyed because Jews did so many bad things. They even did the things we say one should be killed before doing. So the three big averot of idolatry, incestuous relationships or improper relationships, and bloodshed. Right? That if someone came up to you and said, if you don't bow down to this idol, I'll kill you. The sort of rabbinic opinion is you should be willing to die to not bow down to the idol. But if someone came up to you and said, if you don't eat this cheeseburger, I'll kill you, that preserving your life is a very high value and you should eat the cheeseburger and sort of figure out how to resist in other ways. That's sort of like the basics. And then we say that the second temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, wanton or baseless hatred. So the prophets that we're reading now are telling the Bnei Israel to stop doing all these terrible things, right? The Beit HaMikdash is going to be destroyed if we don't sort of get our act together. Let me share my screen. So what I did here is a little different than I think I've done before. Well, there's no connection. There's no obvious or intended, maybe is what I would say, connection to the Parshiot of Matot Masei, right? So much so that like sometimes you read this for just Masei and sometimes Matot Masei, right? They're sort of interchangeable. It's about the weeks, not the Parsha content. So I wanted to look first at some of the sort of overarching themes, and then to share a piece of a resource that I think is beautiful to recommend that connects to the 3 weeks and also to this Haftorah. Okay, so the first piece, and because this is overarching as opposed to, sorry, it's a smidge big here, as opposed to specifically about like one pasuk or another, this first part is all in English. And it's from an article by Rav Moshe Lichtenstein where he's comparing Yirmiyahu, which is our week's Haftorah this week, and Yeshayahu, which is next week. So the ellipses are just because he's contrasting and we're not. So I removed all the contrasting language of like, on the other hand, Yirmiyahu did this. So I think what's important here, what I found very powerful about this article, was thinking about setting the stage, because I think, as I've probably said too many times all year long, I think that the Haftarah are very resonant this year as we suffer from some prophetic era-like tragedies in Israel. And this, to me, felt a little bit like that. So he says, Yirmiyahu lives in a threatened and retreating society that is under constant security pressure. That sentence alone, I thought like, wow, what a way to describe modern day Israel, in my opinion, as well, right? In such circumstances, people turn to otherworldly spiritual factors, both out of a sense of recognition of the nullity of pleasures and a change in priorities that follows from new situation, and out of the hope that the spiritual factor found outside the world of man will be able to overcome the earthly political reality and save them from their enemies. So I will say that what I thought of when I read this is my mother. I just had the great privilege of hosting my mother for the last week at my house. We went on vacation. And she told me that ever since October 7th, the first word she plays in Wordle is peace. And she knows it's not a very good word. If you play Wordle, you would know having a repeating vowel is not particularly astute, savvy as a first move. But there's something in my mother that believes that that is like projecting us towards peace, which is lovely. And we also know it's like not actually true, right? Should she stop playing peace as her first word, likely nothing would change in the world. But there is like this impulse, right? I think that's what he's describing here, is that when you're in such a constant pressure, security pressure, you sort of turn to these things, right? If I stop at every red light, maybe Hashem will bring home a hostage, right? It's like human nature. Seeing the spiritual state of the people rather than the geopolitical alliances as the basis of political reality is what underlies the spiritual struggle in the book of Yirmiyahu. And so, right, I think this is important. Yirmiyahu is not talking about baseless hatred. He is talking about going after other idols, right, doing things that break sort of this spiritual bond with God. Whereas Yeshayahu preached about this and the people ignored his warnings, Yirmiyahu's generation adopted this outlook. But instead of turning to God, they went after vanity, right? So it seems to me what Rav Lichtenstein's point is that for Yeshayahu, the people are like, no, we're fine. And Yirmiyahu's people are like, you're right, this is terrible, we're in danger, you're describing the situation so well. But instead of turning to God, they turn to, other sort of attempts at like bargaining with the powers of the world to make things better. And so what happens in this situation is Yirmiyahu has to struggle with a spiritual error stemming from a perverted view of metaphysical reality, right? What a way to say that they went after idols. And therefore, his primary concern is to emphasize the mistake and express his astonishment, right? And I think if you look at last week's Haftorah and you look at this week's Haftorah, there is a little bit of astonishment, right? Like, how could we forget the God who brought us out of Egypt, the God who created all of these miraculous things for us, right? Like, it's the astonishment at why we would choose idols over God. And since the error is primarily spiritual, his argument is with the priests, the Kohanim, the prophets, the Nevi'im, and the teachers of Torah. Which again, I think in today's world, there's something so interesting about sort of like blaming a nation versus blaming its leaders. And when it's effective to do so and when it's not effective, right? When do you have a new election and when do when do the leaders turn to the people and tell them to fast or to learn more Torah or whatever? The fact that the world of the spirit is beyond the physical world and that God is transcendent creates a difficulty for the ordinary person and obligates the spiritual leadership to guide him. Let us not forget that idols appear near even though they are distant, where God appears distant even though he is near. Therefore, the possibility of error exists, and it falls upon the shoulders of the teachers and the prophets who can see through the religious fog to teach the people. I think to me, this is such an interesting, it feels like touches on so many sort of modern points. But I was struck by this sentence that idols appear near even when they are distant, whereas God appears distant even though God is near. And it was nicely footnoted on the blog post. And so I tracked down this post. So this is not from our Haftorah, but it is from the Yerushalmi version, right? The Gemara Yerushalmi of Masechet Brachot. And to me, it just struck me as a beautiful passage, and so I wanted to share it with you guys. What is his reason, right? Why does someone feel that a idol is near, but even though it is far? Right, my taima, Yisahu al katef, right? That you can carry an idol on your shoulder, right? Such an interesting idea that like there's something very physical about it, right? But at the end of the day, sof davar Eloho imo babai, right? His God is with him in his house. V'hu tzo'ek ad sheyamut, and the person is crying out until he dies. V'lo yishma v'lo yoshia mitzarato. And the idol does not hear you and does not save you. Right? So the idol seems close because you can touch it and you can put it in your living room on like a little stand. But in the end, it's actually quite far away because it's not going to be able to help you. On the other hand, right? Aval HaKadosh Baruch Hu, near Erachok, he seems far, ve'en karov mimenu, but there is no one closer than him. The Amar Levi, so Levi says, so he says, from the earth to the firmament is a walk of 500 years. This is like a funny mathematical proof text of why this works the way it works. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I ellipses the Hebrew as well as I ellipses the English. But what Levi's point is after the ellipses here, right, is Re'eh kama hu gavoa me'olamo. See how elevated God is above his world. But when you enter the Beit Knesset, Adam nichnas lebeit HaKnesset ve'omer achorai ha'amud v'mitzpalel b'lichisha, he whispers that Kadosh Baruch Hu ma'azin et tfilato. So this is, I think, a super powerful theological statement that Rav Lichtenstein is expecting us all to buy into, which is that when we go to shul and we daven in a whisper, as Chana did, as you can see, that's one of the proof texts, right? Or as Tehillim says, God can hear our whispers in shul and God can answer our prayers. And that, of course, I would agree that the idols cannot hear your prayers, even if you're loudly calling them in front of them. But I think at a time where God feels very distant, to say that God hears our prayers, even if God is going to choose not to answer them, is a strong thing to say, right? It's understandable why, as the walls of Jerusalem are coming under siege, why you might feel that God was not actually close. God appears distant, and God is distant, right? Times of the Holocaust, times of October 7th. And yet the Yerushalmi is insistent that that is not true. And I think that is because if it were true, right, God and the idol would be the same. And Yirmiyahu's the pasuk about how Bnei Israel goes after idols, again, I thought was just very beautiful. God says the people have done two wrong things. Kishaim ra'ot asa ami oti azvu makor mayim chayim. They have forsaken me, right? That's bad. To leave God is bad. But they've also hewed out for themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot even hold water, right? So there's this idea that if only we stayed by the fountain of life, the Mayim Chayim, we would have enough to drink. But we leave that. But what's worse than that is we leave it for something that's broken, right? I.e. for idols that seem close but are far. And the Rambam mentions this idea that, like, actually this shows a jealousy of God's, right? It's not just that you left God, it's that you seem to choose some other God over God. And that is like what seems to, that's the two wrong things, right? Leaving God, but not just leaving God, but for like another God, right? Thinking, if you think about it as like a relationship, right? It's like if your partner leaves you, that's hard enough. But if your partner leaves you for someone else, that's like insult to injury, right? And someone that you think obviously is like far inferior to you. And so I think that one of the great themes of this Haftorah is that what the people have done wrong is they have left their partner behind and they have gone to other partners. And there's like an intimacy in that I think is much stronger than what's sort of just in the plainness of the text. And so what is the message, right? If there was a message of the Tlata de Nechemta, de Puranuta, the three afflictive parshiot, what is that thing? It's that God felt that God and Bnei Israel were a couple, and that Bnei Israel has really pained God, right? Has caused God to be jealous and upset by heading out after other cisterns, right? Other methods of drinking. Hello, Nelson. So to me, I think that the first sort of overarching theme is this intensity of the intimacy with God. I don't know if you've ever been to a whisper hall. I think they have one in Chicago, at that museum.
Science and Industry.
Science and Industry. Thank you. They're very, very cool. There's a beautiful one in Boston where I grew up, where you stand on one end of the room and someone else stands on the other end. And because of something about the physics and the architecture of the space, if you whisper into a certain spot in the wall, your partner can hear it, 50 feet away. It's quite remarkable. If you've never been to the Museum of Science and Industry, it's a remarkable museum in and of itself, but the whisper chamber is not to be missed. And I think of this whole idea of the Yerushalmi Brachot as like, we have this incredible gift to have the whisper chamber, right? God feels far, but in fact, if we just whisper our prayers, God will hear them because of the whisper chamber, right? Effect. And we've squandered it. And that's like the great sadness of this reproach, is like you had this great thing and this intimacy, and you've made it so that God cannot take you back at this moment. So I think that's piece one. Piece 2 and 3, as I said, are from a beautiful book called In the Narrow Places, Daily Inspirations for the 3 Weeks. I should have put the author is Dr. Erica Brown. And it's a beautiful book. As you can see, she sort of goes day by day. So you might feel like you've gone too far into the 3 weeks to purchase it for this year, but it is a lovely book, and many segments of it are on Sefaria. So this is I thought, just another beautiful verse from our Haftarah. The Yirmiyahu is very good at using his words to paint these pictures, right? First, we can imagine this like waterfall and then broken cisterns. And now he says, repeating what God says, he says, "V'anochi nataticha shorek kulo, Zera emet. I planted you with noble vines, all with the choicest of seeds. Ve'ech nehafachtali, and how I find you changed, surei hagefen nachria, into a base, an alien vine." Right, this idea that God like sort of carefully tended the seeds that were supposed to come up as rose bushes and came up as some weird invasive weed from some other country, right? That the pain, again, sort of the same pain I see from the beginning of God feeling betrayed by us, feels to me very similar here. Like, can you imagine if you woke up in the morning and your beautifully manicured garden had turned into like a overgrown weed bed? Okay, and what does Dr. Brown say? So she says, because fruit trees are a source of happiness and elemental to a life lived off the land, we are forbidden to experience the pure joy of planting them during the 3 weeks. So another thing that eases us into mourning. In a Haftarah cited earlier, this is our Haftarah here, Yirmiyahu uses the metaphor of planting that opens a world of botanical delight and terror. Right, this is our pasuk here. The image of God as a gardener, gently placing a choice seed among the very special plants, is a tender, loving image. The vine is a hardy plant that ascends its spread itself, right? And she proves it through Tehillim and then through Micha. God as a biblical gardener is an image that appears in Exodus 15:17 in the Song of the Seas, right? Shirat Hayam, where God promises to plant the Israelites on God's own mountain, protected from any danger. And it is also used in Tehillim as a powerful image of resettlement. And as I was reading this, I remembered, I don't know if Tamar and Jerry ever listen, but if they do, Tamar, it reminded me that we had talked in a few different Haftorot about the metaphor of like returning to the land to plant the vineyards. And that was like a very beautiful and powerful image, especially at this time. And this reminded me of that, right? That the ideas of planting are really powerful, right? That's like how we stake our claim to the land of Israel. That's how we know that God is sort of smiling on us as our plants do well. But also to think of God as our gardener. I don't know. To me, I really liked it. I'm curious what you guys think about it. I think it reminded me a little bit of that book about the bunny. Gosh, I don't know if anyone here remembers this book either as child or parents or reading to a small child. There's this book about a bunny, like however far the bunny runs away, the mother will follow. And so it says, like, if you join the circus, I'll be the ringmaster. If you do this, I'll do that. And there's one where, like, if you be a flower, I'll be the gardener. And it sort of reminds me of that. Again, this like loving, intimate moment between God and the people. But at the end of the day, we are the ones who like pull that out from under itself by growing as a weed instead of a flower. Should I pause here, or should we plow ahead through the last piece?
Plow.
Okay, we'll plow ahead, then we'll think all together. Okay, so I want to look at the conclusion, which actually here we had to jump a whole parak, right? So here it is at the top. Our Haftarah is 2:4-28. And then we skip several psukim to get to 3:4, because again, even in a time of puranuta, of when we're supposed to feel reproach and affliction, we're very careful not to end on such a note. And so the last pasuk here is a relatively nice one. Halome ata karati li avi, aluf nu'urai ata. Just now you called to me, Father, you are the companion of my youth. It's it evokes such a strong relationship of parent-child, in addition to that relationship of spouses that we had talked about earlier. And again, this is from the same book, A Different Day, day 4. She says, right, again, she is not talking about Yirmiyahu specifically, but I pulled this piece out. Yet another Haftarah, the second of the season, is from Yirmiyahu, and it touches on the same painful points. In sharp language, it details the mistakes of our ancestors that pulled them away from God, creating an immense separation. But the most painful metaphor is again that of the parent-child in a relationship that is filled with grief. The Haftarah is long and tiring. We feel weighted down by its dense language and criticism. And I would say even like we sort of feel heartbroken by its powerful language. By the time we get to the end, we are not prepared for the rabbinic inclusion of a surprise verse from the next chapter of Jeremiah. Just now you called to me, Father, you are the companion of my youth, right? That's our pasuk. Instead of leaving us with a relationship gone sour, the Haftarah jumps elsewhere and leaves us with a glimpse of reconciliation. And I think that for me this year it feels very resonant, but in every year I think that part of what I like about Tisha B'Av is that like for some there starts to feel like a change of tide towards the end of the day, right? The day is for mourning. Certainly the night is for mourning. The day until Chatzot is for mourning, right? We sit on the floor, we don't learn Torah, we don't do anything, but you get to Mincha and you get to hear a Haftorah, which is nice, and you start to feel that sort of like turning towards a redemptive process. There are some people within the conservative community who stop fasting at Mincha time because we have a state of Israel, right? Acknowledging that although we don't have the Beit HaMikdash, there is like a hope, there is a future redemption. That I'm not suggesting that we do that, but I think it's an interesting practice. And sometimes even just the feeling of like that hopeful turn, you get up off the floor, right? You put on your tefillin if you're a man at Mincha, is beautiful. And it's sort of exemplified in this week's Parshat that we're looking for a glimpse of reconciliation, even if we're not quite there yet. So I think, like, make no mistake, this is a sad Haftarah. Right, I just pulled two verses of sadness from it, but it is, as Dr. Brown says, it is sort of plodding and long and dense. But it gives us this little tiny breath of like that connection is still there, right? That there's, even when we say that God feels jealous or God feels abandoned or neglected, that God will still be there if we reach out in that parent-child relationship, that paradigm. And this, I think, is meant to give us both the inspiration to mourn in the coming week and also to look for that hope wherever we can find it. Over the long, 3 weeks. This Haftarah will bring us through the beginning of no, right up to the 9 days. No, through the beginning of the 9 days, right? The Rosh Chodesh is on Sunday night, Monday, and then the last Haftarah that we read on Shabbat Chazon will carry us through Tisha B'Av. But I definitely would love to hear what other people have to say or any questions about any of these 3 parts.
Sorry, I came in late. I was tied up with all kinds of things. This 7 p.m. schedule.
I know, it's brutal for me too. I'm glad to see you now.
But as it was, I was following one little summary of the Chumash that I have. It's for Bar Mitzvah presents, but I follow. I must confess I do that. But and I was following what you were saying. One thought came to me. I hear several times in different places that Rabbi Akiba was talking with some rabbis after the destruction of the temple, and they see a fox coming out from the temple, and the rabbis say, "Oh, how terrible! Look at what happened to our temple. The animal, the fox, is living there." And Akiba starts laughing. You know the story?
Yeah. But please finish. Give the punchline, right? And they ask why he could be laughing at such a terrible time. And what does he say?
And he says that's a sign that the temple will be rebuilt. They will go back to Jerusalem, because the fox coming out of the temple fulfilled the prophecy that required that to happen. I don't know exactly all the sequence, but it was a sign that we were in the right way. So he was happy. And,
I think of it as like, I feel this way up until Tisha B'Av. Like, it's terrible. I hate fasting. I'm not a good faster. And I'm so anxious. But once Tisha B'Av starts, like, the worst part is over. It's already started. And I think that's what Rabbi Akiva is saying, is that part of the prophecy was that at some point, the lowest point in our history, a fox would run across the ruins of the Beit HaMikdash. And so he says, well, if we're at the lowest point, like, there's only up to go from here, is his point.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think that that's partially why we put this at the end. This last pasuk is to say, like, there's only up from here. We're reading the worst of it. We're not sparing you any sadness, but then good things will happen. Good things will come from it. Yeah, that's a great story to tell here. Thank you, Nelson.
Thanks you for fixing it.
No, it was perfect.
Rabbi Sachs always makes the point that the Greeks have tragedies, that everybody dies and everything is destroyed, but there's no Jewish tragedy. There's always light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
Redemption will come.
Yes, and I think it's a thing you really see in the Torah service part of davening, because even within the parshiot, there is a minhag. You know, if you want to like add in an extra, it's a bar mitzvah, and you need an extra aliyah. You can break up the aliyot however you want, as long as there are 3 psukim in every aliyah, and you don't end or start on a bad thing, which is why the tochacha that we read twice a year is so long, because you can't break it up in the middle because there's never a good part to break on. And then also the Haftorah, right? That the rabbis are not comfortable leaving you on a sad note at the end of the Haftorah. No tragedies here. I like that.
The remarks about tragedy are fitting and provocative. I mean, Rabbi Sachs makes the point that there's no word for tragedy in Hebrew. In biblical
Exactly.
Hebrew.
Yeah.
And presumably the reason is we don't attribute the calamities that happen to us to some immovable fate that can't be changed. We take, to a certain degree, and that's what the prophets are trying to encourage, we take responsibility upon ourselves for what's happened. In other words, it must be because we're not living the Torah that is required of us by God. And what that means is there's no tragedy because it's something we can do something about. Now, if there's any tragedy to Jewish history or the Jewish story, it's that again and again, like in the book of Judges, people stray, they fall into trouble, a judge or a leader arises who can get them out of trouble, they win the war, and for a time, everybody turns back to God and things are okay. And then within a few years, they go back to their old ways, following the gods of their neighbors and so on and so forth. And the spiral goes round and round.
Yeah.
That one could consider to be kind of tragic. But the thing is, the door's always open. And our prophets of the day tell us that we need to turn back and clean up our act. So
yeah, it's, I was just
these Haftorot then resonate with that. They tell you the worst and then remind you that there is an open door.
That's right. That's right.
I
Yeah,
don't
go
know
ahead.
if it's coincidental or not, but the 929 chapters project that
Sure.
many people are studying as if it were a daf yomi.
Yeah.
These weeks we're doing the Psalms numbering in the 70s and 80s, and they make quite a compact unit of reminiscing about all the terrible things that have happened and whose fault it is. And yet they always end these Psalms with at least a couple of verses of hope, of reminding ourselves that God always comes to the rescue in some fashion if we repent to a certain degree, turn back to God. So it's very much in my mind because we just went through those Psalms today. A lot of relationship with these Haftorot of sadness.
It reminds me in the Masechet Shabbat, there's a long list of reasons why the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. And I was just reading something the conservative yeshiva put out online that says that startlingly in all this list of things, never once do the rabbis decide that the reason that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed was like the Roman army was stronger than ours.
Yeah.
Right? Sort of like what you were saying about attributing it to the world, right? And I think that their point and your point is so resonant that if we think it was our mistake, it's a heavy burden to place, but it gives us a path towards making it better. And if we think that our actions don't have anything to do with it, then there's a hopelessness that sort of becomes attached to it. And that's very powerful. And I think that here too, right, in both prophecies from Yirmiyahu and Chazon Yeshayahu, there's always a path out, as you were saying, Judith, right? There's always, these are not the psukim I brought here, but like, what should you say to God? What should you do to get back on track? And so I think that's the prophets always had their eye on the future in that way, and it is inspiring, I think, for today. So, I hope everyone has an okay week this week. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut off the conversation. If anyone had any other thoughts, you're welcome to share.
Just a question. What do you think we need to do to work on the problem of what started on October 7th?
So it's
not in terms of war strategy, but in terms of what we can do spiritually.
It's such a good question. And I was just saying to my husband that it's like, I couldn't be recorded as saying, so I'm saying that I'm not saying this for the recording, that, right, it's not classy to say that we brought the Shoah on ourselves or October 7th on ourselves, but the distance between when the Chorban happened and the canonization of the Gemara happened, I think was and the time in like the world, our worldviews made it acceptable to place the blame on our feet in a way that I think we're uncomfortable doing today. And I think that many people say, right, what is the thing that we can do? What is the thing that we had not been doing was about unity, right? That Israel was tearing itself apart. For good reason. I don't fault the protesters, but there was a lot of discord, the Haredim and the draft dodging and all of the different issues. And that for those first few weeks after October 7th, there was this enormous display of unity, right? People koshering their restaurants so they could bring religious soldiers meals and hosting people and, bringing Hanukkah candles and all these things. And I think that that's probably dissipated a bit over the last few months, right? It's hard to keep up such a strong show of unity, right? We see the protesters coming back out. We see that like the crack lines about how to approach the war, redeeming the hostages or whatever the issues are. And dissent and like healthy dialogue is important. But I do think that the answer traditionally that we would give is to work on not sinat chinam, but ahavat chinam, right? To find baseless love instead of baseless hatred. I also know that there are a lot of interesting, especially with the Chatufim, the hostages, interesting campaigns to increase Torah learning or Shabbat candles, like a little bit of like a Chabad vibe, right? The Hirsch's family donated a Sefer Torah, right? Things that bring light into the world, maybe in some way. It's kind of like what the doctor says, like, it's good to drink lots of liquids because it's good to drink lots of liquids. If it makes you feel better, that's a benefit. There's a doctor in the room, but right, that, it's always good advice to give advice that is helpful, even if it might not be correlating to the treatments, because it won't hurt, right? It never hurts to have ahavat chinam and to do mitzvot and learn Torah. And we hope that in that merit, we will bring peace.
I think the Dvar Torah you gave last week is part of the answer here. That is, yes, we're going to have differences, we're going to have arguments, and we're going to have reason to protest in the street. But when all's said and done, if your protest is for the sake of heaven, it's still possible to carry on that argument with our antagonists in a way that in the end maintains respect and love, helping relationships with your adversaries. And I don't think people in Israel or even Jews here realize how destructive their mannerisms for dissent and argumentation can be, particularly vis-a-vis people from other cultures or lifestyles who suppress that kind of anger and vitriol. And that contributes in part to the bad state we're in, because people don't take us seriously. And as far as, nobody can say out loud or suggest that the Holocaust, we brought that on ourselves. Obviously, that's simplistic. And yet I always think back to my father's story. After my mother died, he went around digging up relatives and trying to reconstruct the family tree. And he had uncovered this whole branch of uncles in Canada. He went up to visit them and he spent a wonderful weekend. They're all telling stories about the old country and hilarious stories about how his horse trading ancestors would pull the wool over the eyes of the Polish peasants and selling their horses and, actually engaging in slightly fraudulent practices. He said, even as we were all laughing at these funny stories with the tears running down our cheeks, he's thinking to himself, and they wonder why their village mates in Poland were not excited about seeing them come back after the war. Little things add up. And even with the horrors of October 7th, I can't even bring myself to ask out loud, what was that dance party all about on the last day of the holiday of Shavuos? Is this really as important as celebrating Simchas Torah and so
It's
on?
hard, right? Because even as we try to understand what we've done wrong, we sort of stray towards, not striving to understand the other, right? Certainly, I would not have been found at such a festival, but I think for many people who were there, it was a religious experience of sorts. And
yes, I can understand that. At the same time, the
yeah.
dedication to secularism without understanding just what that means, I really find scary.
Sadly, there are so many places at which we can try to find sort of, a place to lay blame, which I know is not what you're 100% trying to do, Judith. But, even thinking about the women who were unarmed and not listened to at the border. I see Nelson. Okay, thank you. Enjoy Mincha. Sorry
Thank you.
I look forward to when Mincha goes on the other side of this class again.
I know it's starting to come down.
Yeah, soon,
Yeah.
just a few more weeks.
All right.
Anyway, yes, I think it is very complicated, and the best thing to do is to listen to the Haftorot and to sort of try to find a way back to Hashem and back to mitzvot, and from there, hopefully, it will all come together. So I hope that your 3 weeks continue to be meaningful. I look forward to next week, when we'll finish up with the Puranuta before moving on to the Nechemta, which we also desperately need this year and every year. But wishing everyone a happy early Shabbat Shalom, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you, Rabbanit.